the clicker, which is right here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Zube Lecture Series. This is our last Zube Lecture Series of the first half of the term. So midterms next week. We will not have a lecture on Thursday. We'll be back in 2 weeks. I am Peter Dunn. I'm the faculty coordinator for the Zube Lecture Series here in the Departments of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. Thank you for the warm welcome. You're not here to see me, though. So you might already know that the Zube Lecture Series is made possible by a gift from Irv and Margaret Zube. Irv Zube was a chair of our department for a number of years, and this endowment allows us to bring in great speakers from all over to enhance our academic community in landscape architecture and today in regional planning. So thank you for coming. Look for whatever else we have coming up in the rest of the semester. But today we're very excited to welcome Alejandra Reyes, and here to introduce her is our own Professor Daryl Ramsey-Musolf.
Great, so let's get a round of applause. Attaboy, Peter. So everyone, I'm Professor Daryl Ramsey-Musolf. I teach housing, planning, global cities, and introduction to land use. And I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alejandra Reyes. Let's give a round of applause for her. Now we've raised the stakes up, so it better be good. So, Alejandra Reyes and I have known each other probably for about 4 years now. We met through the Planners of Color Interest Group at the ACSP. And so we have shared research knowledge because we're both interested in housing. Me more so in Los Angeles, California. With Alejandra, it's more of a international, starting with Mexico, Brazil, and now California. So let me read her bio for you. She's an assistant professor in urban and planning at public policy at UC Irvine School of Ecology. Her research centers on questions of governance around housing policy, finance, production, and access, and highlights the critical influence of political and economic factors on housing and urban development. Political. You think housing's political?
Absolutely.
You think so?
100%.
You think that's political?
It is.
Okay, right. Okay, so you can hear she can talk. Previously, she was a 219 postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance in University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. How was Toronto?
It's amazing. Even though during the winter it can be a little bit too much, especially when you have to shovel snow.
So is the snow this high?
Not as high.
This high?
No, a little bit low.
Like that. Okay, fine. So she got her BA in architecture at University of California, Berkeley, and a master's and PhD of community and regional planning at UT Austin, Texas. Yeehaw! So what do you miss about Texas?
Ooh, not the heat.
What about the barbecue?
Barbecue, 100%.
All right. So her recent publications are, and this should give you a little flavor, Housing as a Battlefield, Mexico's Housing Paradox, Tensions Between Financialization and Access, and then the distinctive evolution of housing financialization in Brazil and Mexico. With that, let's give her a round of applause for the show is about to begin.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Thank you, everyone. Really, now I'm in the quarter system, so I do feel that the stakes are a little bit higher if midterms are next week and you're here. So I really appreciate that. I do want to thank Dr. Ramsey-Musolf in particular for the invitation, as well as the Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning Department here at UMass, Amherst. It's actually my first time here, a really lovely campus, and so really, really happy to be here. As Darryl mentioned before, a lot of my work, my published work at least, has centered on finding civilization processes, and so just to translate that, my work really centers on the implications of the subprime crisis in the Mexican context where I'm from. But I'd also like to make a point or argue that even though we've all experienced these global and seemingly hegemonic trends, there's a lot that governments can do. And that has a little bit to do with the publication and the comparative work that I did between Mexico and Brazil to cushion the effects of these global trends and economic processes, right? Now, even though my past research centered very much in national finance policy, now my work is really much more centered on the intersection between local, regional, state levels of government. And I think it's going to be particularly interesting, hopefully to you, because it's within the US context, but also if you're interested in practice. Especially also because it has to do with housing, which unfortunately I think more and more of us realize is a really pressing issue, right? And so, let me see, probably stand around here. So I'll spend quite a bit of time, and I hope you won't mind that, because as researchers and perhaps you as students do want to have answers or ideas about how to tackle certain challenges, housing-related ones, perhaps in this case, in the particular regions in which you find yourselves, right? And so this presentation and this work, drawing from a state and a particular sub-region within the state that's across the country from here, literally, might not seem as relevant, right? And believe you me, I was sharing with Darryl, that's also a lot of what I've been hearing from my peer reviewers as I try to publish this research. But thankfully, if you had the opportunity to go over some of the work that I've written, one of the articles is being published in the Journal of Planning and Education Research, which is a leading journal within the planning profession. And so, to a certain extent, this begins to be somewhat of established knowledge, right? And so, I'll share a little bit of why I chose to both research the context, the geographical context that I'm focusing on, not only because I do live there, as well as the topics that I'm interested in. So when it comes to housing pressures and housing hardships, I think many of us would agree that there's many reasons why we are facing the quote-unquote housing crisis that we see both in the US and abroad, right? There's been many policies at different levels that have contributed to that. But perhaps you've heard that local governments in particular, with things like zoning, have had a reasonable part to play when it comes to constraining housing production, housing development, and I would make a point to emphasize that that's the case particularly when you talk about low-income housing and dense housing as well, right? But beyond only blaming or only focusing on what local governments do, I'm also very interested in seeing how different government levels interact, right? And so in this particular case, I'm looking at tensions between state housing law at the California level, but also its implementation, right? What does it happen when it actually, when the state government is actually aiming to get it enforced? And so we're sitting actually in one of those states that historically has been more proactive than others in trying to intervene and in trying to push localities to build their fair share of housing. And so here I'll just note something really quickly in case perhaps some of you haven't taken housing policy classes. So when we talk about fair housing, we're referring to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, coming out of the civil rights movement after the acknowledgement that the U.S. was moving towards a separate and unequal society when it came to many things, but certainly when it came to housing, right? And so that's why some states, and I would argue increasingly more and more states, and that's why perhaps we should care about what's going on in other places, right? Because governments at different levels, what they do is they copy each other, right? They see what best practices are out there, and then they aim to implement them as well. And so the other reason why I thought that Orange County and this particular topic would be interesting to research is because I would argue that there's a little bit of a misalignment in our policy priorities when we think about what I've called localized and privatized interests. And so if we think about our intent to protect property values, for instance, at all costs, right? I'd argue that that's a private interest, right? Not a public or societal interest. A societal interest would be housing provision, making sure that our populations are sheltered, right? And so we can see how there's a tension between those two. And now turning to the specific context of California, and while I don't know a ton about the Massachusetts context, I suspect that something similar has happened here. We've had laws on the books for really a long time. So since the late 1960s, California has had laws to make sure that localities and jurisdictions are planning for the housing needs of all residents. That, however, hasn't really translated into something meaningful or enforceable, right? For many, many years, these laws have lacked what we sometimes call teeth, meaning that their enforcement is not a reality, right? And so cities have really, for the most part, disregarded them. However, and this is another reason and justification for why the California case is interesting at this moment, since 2017, over 100 bills have been passed in California, precisely to make sure that state housing law actually has implications on the ground, right? And so that really, of course you can imagine how these 100 plus bills have meant to do many different things, admittedly sometimes even in opposition to each other. However, a couple of the ones that I'm particularly interested in are the ones, as I mentioned before, that are aiming to expand fair housing goals, right? So making sure that all city, even wealthy jurisdictions, low-density jurisdictions, etc., are really promoting their fair share of development. I'll tell you a tiny little bit about my research without boring you too much, but just so that you know where all the information that I'm sharing really is coming from. So as I mentioned before, I'm really interested in looking at the tensions between state housing law and local implementation in what I call, but I'll show why I call it that, a concentrated area of affluence, right? A county within Southern California. And I also want to see what has been the evolution of these intergovernmental relationships, because remember how I told you that before there wasn't really a lot that cities were doing to follow state law, whereas now there might be, or there is, that's what I'm sort of trying to answer, right? And I'll share a couple of maps and spatial analysis that I've done to try to answer these questions and to complete my research. The bulk of it is qualitative, right? And so I've looked at over 200 newspaper articles, many public meetings, and some government documents. And so these sources of qualitative data, they've mostly been centered on a couple of different things. One, an appeals process in which a lot of cities were aiming to really go against state housing law and state mandates that they consider to be very cumbersome. And second, a revision process that cities go through with their housing elements or plans, that's how we call them in California, housing elements, around 2021, right? And so to see how these political processes and policy processes were playing out. Now, out of that content analysis, there were several things that came out that of course were very recurrent and caught my attention. But the two main ones were state-local conflict, and the second one was policy change. So of the two articles that I've shared with you, one is in press, and it's centered on the appeals process, so that's going to be the bulk of my presentation today. But I do want to share a little bit of the article that's under review, because I think it's the more hopeful one, because it shows us how, even though there's been significant contention, we also are starting to see slow but sure policy change around housing, even in these really conservative region, right? And so I'll walk you through a couple of the reasons why I think Orange County, the main region that I'm looking at, I think is particularly useful, both empirically and theoretically, to look at. On the one hand, it has always been very reactionary when it comes to housing policy. Some cities in particular are very well known for their confrontational demeanor, for engaging in lawsuits with the state. They've gotten sued by nonprofits as well and other members of civic society. Other cities are arguably more diplomatic. And so there's cities, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, like Newport Beach or Laguna Beach, that maybe are not as loud and as publicly confrontational, but somehow they've gotten single unit allocations in 8-year cycles in the past. So it has made a lot of us wonder what have been the political processes behind closed doors that have allowed for those disparities to happen, right? For housing growth to be promoted in some cities but not in others. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's one particular city, although increasingly followed by some other cities as well, that is sort of like playing against the norm of the status quo in a place like Orange County, in the sense that it's starting to enact really contentious policies as well, like rent control. Perhaps some of you have heard of why rent control it's not an ideal policy, and we can talk and debate a little bit more about that in a second. But policies like rent control, policies like eviction protection ordinances, and it's by far, and I'll show a couple of graphs for about that, a city that's really building a lot of low-income housing in particular. Oh, sorry. A second reason why Orange County is an interesting place to look at. So you've probably heard that even though housing prices are skyrocketing in most places in the US and abroad, California is a particularly expensive place. But even within California, if you look at state housing prices and also at LA region housing prices, OC far surpasses them, right? And I don't have post-pandemic data, but in the last few years, it has gotten so much worse than what we see on this graph. Third, and this is a particularly important and interesting one for me, Getz and Williams, two prominent scholars, coined the term racially concentrated areas of affluence a couple of years ago. Interestingly, California has picked up these term and definition, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second, and use it with the purpose of expanding its fair housing laws and goals, right? And so what racially concentrated areas of affluence are, and we're seeing Orange County on the map and RCAAs in blue, are census tracts that have a very high, with respect to their regions, share of white population. So let's say if you're familiar with Southern California, it's actually majority Latinx. But some of these census tracts, and in the case of Orange County, entire cities are 80% plus white in terms of demographic composition. And they're very affluent too, significantly above the regional average, right? And so hopefully that was somewhat clear. Now, as I mentioned before, again, I've tried to really make a point as to why OC, or Orange County, is a good place to be researching, and I would argue also an understudied case, right? Because most people are often looking at LA County and its 80 plus cities, but not looking at the suburban areas around them. And so one of the things that I would argue is that, yes, Orange County is a little bit of an extreme, but at the same time it's very representative, unfortunately, of the segregated diversity that we find in our metropolitan regions throughout the US, right? That's one thing that I would argue. Also, if we think about how suburbs have first emerged, but also evolved through time, we also see similarities, right? We know that suburbs unfortunately emerged out of processes of white flight and perceived risks of living in inner city areas. But they've also evolved from dormitory suburbs or neighborhoods to sometimes really significant economic hubs. And that's certainly the case of Orange County, right? We have a University of California campus, we have amusement parks, we have a lot of business complexes, the largest malls in the West Coast, and so there's a lot of economic activity going on there as well, despite its exclusionary character. And a couple of the other things that I'll share about that are very specific to Orange County, but at the same time, I think important when we think about other regions like it, is that we know that suburban areas have been very politically influential throughout the US, and when we talk about higher levels of government, right? They have not only been able to shape what goes on within their regions, but they've also been able to shape arguably state and even national level policy. When it comes to welfare policy, when it comes to many other immigration policy, etc. But I'll give a specific example that has to do with California in particular. So within OC, homeowners, but also business owners, push for what we know was Prop 13 a while back in the 70s. And Prop 13 was, or is, it still is, it's a cap on property taxes, right? And so these cap on property taxes doesn't only mean that perhaps low income or middle income homeowners feel less pressure because their property taxes go up. It also means that business owners or property owners of businesses also enjoy that same cap. Unfortunately, you can think what that means for local governments, because local governments are funded through property taxes. So much so that OC itself, what it started to do because of that property tax cap was to set an investment fund to be able to continue to fund its government activities. But in the 1990s, we had the saving and loans crisis. Many of you are probably too young to know about that. But it led to then the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history. We've had more now, unfortunately, but it led actually to the dismissal of over 3,000 employees then, right? And so I think it's interesting for us to think about this redefinition of private-public functions that have been very much pushed for in places like OC. I think I'm going to move a little bit faster because I see that I already have like a half an hour under my belt. But I'll show you a couple of more maps that show the differences between different sections of Orange County. So if you're not familiar with Southern California, just think about LA being north of OC, right? And so we can see sort of the difference between North OC in terms of things like density and Southern OC. We can see the same sort of division when we look at median income and rents, right? Now, I do want to bring a couple of things to your attention. Perhaps you're able to see that housing rents are much higher in Southern OC than the Northern OC. But there's a couple of exceptions, right? Maybe some of you are able to see Villa Park, which is sort of like a dark blue city within a lighter blue one. That's a city that's very proud of its single-family only zoning in half-acre lots. So it doesn't mean that you can only build single-family homes, but they have to be fairly large as well, right? So you can imagine how prohibitive that is. But on top of that, the fact that it's sort of embedded within another city shows the way in which a lot of cities have developed. They originally were private subdivisions that eventually became cities, right? And with all the power and influence that entails. Now, another thing that I think it's important for us to think about is that on top of density, income, rents, etc., northern cities are the ones that are almost solely responsible for low-income housing provision, even though the entire region, of course, economically functions in relation with each other, right? And so I think that's an important thing for us to think about. Now, I'll introduce you here, I'll give you a little bit more reference about our state housing policy and how it intersects with local implementation. I know there's a ton of numbers here, and so perhaps try to just focus on a couple of the bolded ones, because what I want to draw your attention on is the fact that even though population shares haven't really shifted very much through the years or in the last decade or so, housing allocations were significantly low for a place like Orange County in the past, right? Because, and this is some of the work that Professor Ramsey Musolf has published on, because a lot of the growth was being pushed towards inner cities and counties that tend to be lower income, right, where housing is more affordable, exempting coastal and wealthier cities from contributing with their fair share of housing growth, right? With reforms that have passed after 2017, that shifted considerably, as perhaps you can see on the table there. And this is what has brought a lot of contention since then. And here, just a really quick note, a lot of the wealthy coastal cities in Orange County have recently argued that the reason why they got really low allocations in the past is because they have really high residential vacancy rates. However, many of these cities or these vacancy rates correspond to multi-million vacation homes and second homes that really are not accessible to the public at large. And so they have now also gotten much larger allocations. And so I'll move to the heart of my research and try to go over it in like 15 minutes or so. So I shared that this paper that I shared with you was mostly on the appeals process that was aiming to really push back against new housing allocations that many cities considered were way too high for them to really plan for, right? And so within Southern California, Orange County cities led that process, right? They appealed their numbers in the most significant rate, but 4 appeals were particularly significant and actually historical. 4 cities, and very unfortunately Irvine was one of them, appealed for the numbers of Santana, one of the lowest income cities in the county and the region, 77% Latinx, to have higher numbers, right? And so think a little bit about what that means, right? If historically these cities that have been assigned single-digit numbers to build like 2-4 housing units within an 8-year period, and then now feel that the allocations that they've been given are unfair. And I'll explain a little bit more about that, right? And so here I wanted to provide a little bit of reference as to how these processes have happened in some other regions within the state. The Bay Area process was also particularly contentious, although of course it's it's not a region that's as large, and so that's significant. And another important thing is that through the appeals process, what cities can generally do is appeal the application of the methodology through which these allocations were sort of granted to different jurisdictions. You cannot appeal the methodology itself, but that's what a lot of cities did. They also contested Santana's growth projections because, as you might imagine, it's one of those cities that, because it's lower income, there's a lot of growth and development happening, gentrification, displacement processes are happening. And thirdly, and perhaps paradoxically, when we think about densifying certain areas, etc., many of these cities were arguing that because Santana is closer to LA, where a lot of jobs are, or has better transit access, etc., it would make more sense to just keep building in Santana. And that's a little bit strange to hear from a city government who admits that it doesn't perhaps have the transit systems, etc., that it could to better connect regionally, right? But another thing that I'd quickly like to note is that that Orange County cities continue to be very, very engaged in regional governance processes. And so the appeals board was actually chaired by an OC council member, right? Here I'll just really quickly show, I wanted to reference and to show you how we started to get polling data since 2018. And so I could quickly show that even though a city like Irvine produces a ton of market rate housing, really when it comes to low income housing, it's been Santana who's been producing the most low income and affordable housing in the region, right? And so talking a little bit more about the methodology used to allocate these housing units throughout the region. So remember how allocations were able to be very disparate before. Now, there were a couple of considerations that had to be taken into account, many having to do with fair housing goals. And so SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, came up with a designation for disadvantaged communities, aiming to reverse the poverty concentration, the segregation that had been fueled in previous decades, and cap the number of units allocated to cities with really low resources or access to opportunity, right? And so that's what happened to Santana. Because a really significant share of its population lives in low resource census tracts, it didn't get a very high allocation this time around, right? As I mentioned before, both in the Bay Area and also in Southern California, there was a lot of contention about this, right? Many local governments were deeming as unfair having to absorb the housing units from these lower income cities. And so a couple of the other things that I think would be interesting to note, and I actually did want to read you a couple of these quotes. So when this designation was proposed for the methodology, Yorba Linda, one of those cities that appealed for Santana's number to get higher, passed a city resolution that read in part what I have above. Local control is the best means to protect the city of Yorba Linda, its residents and business owners, and to promote the goals and policies of the community, and prevent significant threat of lasting damage. Now, in the meetings that were taking place for the appeals, another council member from Orange County, making reference to their now higher housing allocations, said cities are being forced to wipe out profitable uses to build the slums of tomorrow, right? And so that's sort of like the conception that many OCCD leaders have around even thinking of planning for low-income or affordable housing, right? However, I think it's notable to mention, and this is sort of the silver lining of this research, even though looking at this level of contention can be a little bit disparaging, is that at the end of the day, these appeals didn't go anywhere, right? And so because the appeals board, even being chaired by an OC council member who very frequently delayed meetings, almost filibustering them, or at least that's what it felt like, there's 2 county representatives from each county. And so at the end of the day, motions were carried to block these appeals, right? I'm doing time. So I was gonna go over a couple other ways in which OCCDs continue to spend, unfortunately, a lot of time, energy, resources that at the end of the day are taxpayer resources on these battles and these confrontations. But I think I prefer to give you a little bit of the outlook of how policy change is also happening in the region, right? And so this is part of the second paper that I told you about, not yet published, but under review. And so this paper is really also looking at a lot of this contention between the state and cities, between cities, unfortunately, among jurisdictions, intra-jurisdictional tensions. So sometimes you'll see a public meeting and see that increasingly, even though this didn't used to be the case, public comment will, for the most part, be supportive of affordable housing or dense housing, but then council members will vote the other way, right? And so I think that's interesting to see. But what it's more interesting even, I would argue, is that especially in North OC, even though our jurisdictional boundaries used to be called the orange curtain, just because of how hard it was to access and how exclusionary Orange County was, North OC in particular has become very diverse, and I would argue allowed for many different constituents to organize and push for policy change, right? And so this has been the case with the rent stabilization ordinance that I was telling you about. Residents and organizers actually failed 3 times before they were able to have the city council pass it. And as I mentioned before, we can talk more about this in Q&A if you want to. Rent control is very controversial, but when it came to just cause evictions, meaning that landlords have to have an actual reason for evicting tenants, not only wanting to raise the rent, and if they don't have that reason, they then have to pay tenants 2 months' rent. So this particular ordinance that passed first in Santana has actually become an inspiration and has now been emulated by a couple of other cities in the county, right? And there's many other things that would have been unheard of before, like inclusionary zoning ordinances that cities have been adopting, moving away from voter initiatives that make it very hard to build housing. They've been setting housing funds, which is something very important and a place where state governments and the national government arguably should be doing a lot more to fund affordable housing. And so there's a lot really going on to be hopeful for, despite all of this contention. And so to end, I'll leave you with 3 main takeaways. So the first one I already sort of discussed at the beginning of this lecture, and has to do with the tension between what's a privatized or a private interest, such as property values. And we often don't think about it like this, right? Because perhaps even none of us care about property values. We think it's in our public interest to maintain them, but that really is a private interest. And societal needs, such as housing, right? And how one has been able to overshadow the other, but that's starting to be reversed through the involvement of different levels of government. Second, really the second point has to do with the last thing I said previously. There's a weakening happening in relation to the reactionary leverage, or the leverage that reactionary cities have to impede housing development and low-income housing development in particular. And third, as I was mentioning before, that some cities are able to leverage state-level policy to really implement noticeable policy change. And so I'll leave it at that because I really do love to engage in Q&A. And thank you again. Any questions? And to be honest, anything that has to do with housing, I'm happy to engage in and talk about housing for days on end. Yes?
I guess I'm curious, when you talk about sort of the fair share allocation, I just want to make sure I understand, that's sort of about affordable housing. Is the same debate going on about missing middle housing?
So actually, that's a really great question that I didn't explain with enough time. So the way in which, so the state creates these projections in accordance with councils of government or MPOs, and they do so for all income levels. So that's a great question. So they do, I would say that about 40% of these projections generally correspond to very low, like extremely low and very low and low income housing. But then absolutely, there's a percentage that's for moderate income housing and a percentage for market rate. I will say that I showed very quickly a map, like the bulk of the housing that we're producing is market rate housing, and the most important need is for very low and extremely low income housing. Does that?
Does, but can I do a follow-up? Are the politics different? Like, is Irvine okay with multifamily missing middle but not with affordable, or are they the same politics?
Yeah, no, I think definitely, I would argue at least that the lowest income housing is the hardest sometimes to approve in some places. One of the things that I think I very quickly mentioned was that a place like Irvine historically has been a top housing producer. Only San Diego and LA, who are much larger cities, produce more housing than Irvine. But when it comes to low-income housing, it's a lot tougher. So yeah, absolutely. A place like Irvine is a little bit more used to density, but low-income housing still has a lot of resistance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned rent control. Can you talk about when those policies are effective and when those may not be effective?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's going to be a controversial answer, but I'll give you my take on it. So historically, rent control has always been deemed as a negative policy, especially by economists, who argue that if you put rent control, or if you pass rent control policies, you'll hinder housing production, right? Because if landlords or developers don't feel that they can profit enough from it, then they won't build it, right? I would argue that even though we keep using that argument, it doesn't apply as much, because a lot of the rent control ordinances that have been passing for quite a while now are called like second or third generation rent control policies, where a lot of new housing production is not subject to it, right? Precisely to avoid hindering new housing production. And so these policies, I would argue, are even timid to an extent. And so, and here I'm going a little bit away from the focus of this paper, but I do teach about this all the time. And so if we think about rent control policies in New York, like let's say pre-1990, or rent control policies in places like Germany, the argument that some have made, and I agree, is that when rent control is in place, those types of policies have been in place, rental markets are profitable. They're just not wealth extracting. So meaning that you cannot just profit crazily from it, as a lot of financialized housing now aims to do. I hope that sort of.
Yeah, thank you.
But this is controversial. Not everyone would agree with me. Yes.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the language that cities are using to resist, and you talked about this some, but are they just being explicit and saying, we don't want poor people here, or keep out the minority? Like, does it come out that way? Or is it more, of course we want affordable housing, of course we're going to be inclusive, but we just need to study this a little bit more. We just need to take a little more time. We want local control. Like, what's the language and arguments that they're using?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'll admit that perhaps the most extreme quote that I came across is one of the ones that I showed about producing the slums of tomorrow, which to me is already somewhat problematic. But so the main, and this is interesting because I think I have this on my second unpublished paper. The main reason that cities are giving for their hesitancy of producing low-income housing is revolves around tax and wealth generators. And so they argue that, and so I think it's very much along the lines of what these council members said, right? Cities are being forced to wipe out profitable uses to build the slums of tomorrow. And so without perhaps those words, that's what they keep saying. However, one of the things that I find interesting is that wealthier cities will make this argument a lot more than lower income cities will, right? And so that to me is, that to me also has a lot to do with what we've promoted in terms of extreme competition among jurisdictions, instead of sort of collaboration and understanding that some issues such as housing are or should be dealt at a regional scale. And so, yeah, I would say the number one excuse has to do with wealth generation.
A follow-up to that? So I'm sort of curious, one of your slides noted that Orange County has more jobs than households. Where are chambers of commerce in this? Are they saying we do need housing for service workers so they can stay in Irvine, for example?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And yeah, so the quote that you were mentioning refers to Irvine, so it might not be applicable to every single city, but many of them. Yeah, I would say that chambers of commerce, so interesting coalitions and alliances, I guess, are forming. Perhaps many of you have heard of the Jimmy movement, right? And so the Jets in My Backyard movement. And so this movement really has created coalitions that are very supportive, by and large, of building, I will argue, market rate housing in particular, right? And so to an extent, that's why perhaps the state has been able to pass all the bills that it has. And that's why I think very conservative jurisdictions are losing leverage and political influence. But I would argue that a different story completely unfolds when you do talk about low-income housing or things like rent control. Interestingly, and a little bit perhaps away from this research, on the ballot this year we have a proposition to repeal Costa-Hawkins, which is an act that limits the ability that cities have to enact rent control ordinances. The GMP movement is against it. And so that shows you how a lot of the discourse that and yeah, this is perhaps a topic for a different day, but the pro-housing discourse that we have, I think, is disregarding noticeably low-income housing and tenant protections, unfortunately, yeah.
So what does the average UCI student think about housing in Orange County? I mean, I'm sure they watch that television show OC, right? And the Lost Hills, and have this idealized view, and then they come to UC Irvine. Is the student experience in a bubble?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I always wonder, because I feel that the OC, perhaps it's more of a program of millennials, and maybe some Gen Zers don't know about it. But no, I mean, the UCI student population is, I always talk about this, because even as an instructor and a professor, it's rough. I think it's very diverse. So we do admit a lot of first-generation students, and so I think we have like a whole range of experiences. We have super hyper-privileged students alongside students that are working 2-3 jobs, commuting 2-3 hours because it's easier for them to live in LA than in Orange County. And so, but I would argue that by and large, and this is something hopeful for me, that by and large, Gen Zers and younger generations are a lot more critical of how we've handled housing policy historically and currently, and are largely very open, or a lot more open, right, to density, to making sure that, to even thinking of shelter as a right rather than an asset. So yeah, that's what I perceive among my students.
Anyone else? Okay then, let's give us a round of applause for Dr.